We've gotten really far already with our bulldozer, and pretty much all the main components are there. In this video, what we'll be doing is creating a few small details that you might miss otherwise. As you can see me here, I'm starting off with another simple cylinder, and I'll be creating it's a small lamp that lights the pneumatic systems on the back of the bulldozer, so that even when things are dark, the operator can check on the systems at the back. Now, on the previous videos, we might have skipped now and then showing you the creation of this sort of details. So this is a video that specifically shows how I go about creating a detail like this. Mostly it's quite simple. This light, it's slightly rounded, but it also has a main rectangular shape. I'm starting off with a square, and I'll be adding extra edges to control the smoothing later on. I just try to make sure that this thing looks interesting. It's still just a stupid little light, but I try to add bevels and some extrudes and insets there to make sure that the shape is interesting enough to look at and that it looks detailed. Using some slight scaling and adding a few extra edges. And scaling these in. There we have like a thicker edge that runs around. Some control edges. Some extra control edges. And then I move these around slightly. And make sure that these all fit together nicely. That needs to taper a little bit at the back. And I need to move this out to get the general shape right. And then when I've done that, I'm selecting all the corner edges and performing a chamfer on them to get those rounded edges in there instead of getting a complete circle because I was using a square. Now, of course, I need to connect up these parts here. I'm just selecting those vertices two at a time and then hitting connect to make an edge between them that bridges. So that looks about good. I think I can get the shape a little bit nicer if I add another edge in the center and scale that out slightly just to get the shape down better. And you see it's easier to work in this way. First get all the lines that run around and then do the ones that define the actual global shape. Right, so I'm positioning that there. And that looks like it's sitting in the right position. Need to add a small little detail on the top there. This is a spline. I'm going to position correctly. Then I'm going to add a few extra edges there. Then perform a few extrudes to get an interesting shape in there. This is just a really small, easy detail, but it's going to add to that light. Of course, insets and extrudes at both ends, and then attach it to the main shape. And that's pretty much it for that light. So we move on to the next one. And this, again, it's another light, and we can just use the same shape that I created just a minute ago. These are the tail lights, the rear lights for the bulldozer. Because obviously, since this bulldozer needs to signal a little bit to other vehicles if it's going to brake, if it's at night, it needs to have tail lights. So these tail lights are in these small recessed areas, and well, they're not so complex. There's that one big light, and then there's a slightly smaller one. Thing is, they do have like a grating that covers them to prevent projectiles from hitting them too easily and destroying them. You can imagine if they leave these taillights unprotected in a war zone, they'd have to replace them like every 2 days or something, so they want to avoid that. So I'm just creating the basic shapes here that I can use to create these inside details out of, using the fillet. And then, of course, trying to change the interpolation here so it's not too high, that when I apply the smoothing to it, it doesn't over smooth things. Selecting these two faces and then performing an extrude so that they are nicely rounded off. And I don't think I need to add that much more detail to it. Looking at the reference, this shape looked almost completely flat, and not much attention will go to it since, as you can see me creating here, there's some armor plating and some armor bars that cover it, and this pretty much hides a lot of the stuff I've created in there. So no reason to put too much detail in there. So there's these boxy parts that are used to attach them to the main body, and then the actual bars themselves that are welded to these metal plates, and these provide the actual protection. I'm just adding a few more segments here to prevent the fact from things moving wrongly because there aren't enough segments. I take one of these, I remove the segments, and I move these ends up and down to get them in the correct position. Try to position this right. And then I take one of these nuts. And of course, I need to add those to show how this part is fastened to the body itself. Then attach them, and attach that main part as well. And then copy it to the other side so that we can show how things are attached there. Got to make sure that it's not floating here. And for that reason, I need to cap it up at the back. And then I need to connect those edges again because the shape is a little bit more complex than a single rectangle. So it's up to me to fix that back again so we don't have any end-ons that could provide smoothing errors. As you can see, it's just a little bit of bridge, a little bit of connect, and we're done. And then, of course, a final edge to control the smoothing. Now add Turbo Smooth to it. And with that done, I can just simply copy it to the other side as an instance. Need to do the same thing for the lights. And once that's done, I've created the tail lights for the bulldozer. And immediately it looks a lot more interesting once I've done that. Now there are a few extra details that stick out of that back covering plate that I modeled a while ago. And of course, it always pays off to add a few of these nuts. I'm not all that sure how these look in real life, so I'm just adding these myself to make it a little bit more interesting. Now the Ripper, there are a few more details that sit on that. A few of them are like plates to attach chains, to attach cables, to attach hooks. And this is one of those mounting brackets. It's a plate that's bolted onto the Ripper, and then there's this upstanding piece of plate with holes in it that provides a means of attaching cables and chains. So I'm just creating that with the simple box modeling. And what I'm doing here is, of course, this shape is rounded at the top, so I need to make sure that when it's rounded, the loops run correctly around it. Then I add a few more loops to be able to get that rounding in there nicely. Something like that. Okay. That looks okay. Then I add a few extra edges, and the reason for these edges are, well, first of all, to provide enough segments for the smoothing to work with. Secondly, I need to be able to create some holes in there. And I need to add a little bit more shape detail at the back there. Alright, then I select the faces where I want to create a hole. Make sure I select both on two sides, perform an inset, delete the faces, and then I'm going to use the loop tool to create the actual rounding in there. Now you can see there's a few problems. It creates bigger ones, it creates smaller ones. It's not really consistent in its results. So I just decided to delete one side and then continue with that, and then add the symmetry at the end. Some edges there. Make this slightly smaller. And just add some extra prepping edges for when I add the Turbo Smooth to it. So there we are, that looks okay. In case you didn't notice, this was a part that is on the bottom of the Ripper. I was working upside down all this time. And this part, well, it attaches, it's an attachment for this little hook that hangs down. And I think this hook is used to attach chains or something to it. So the Ripper can actually drag things as well. So it's like something to tow, I don't know, whatever they need to tow with this bulldozer. Right now I'm modeling the hook that will be attached to this bracket. And I'm following the same way as I used for the shank for the Ripper itself. Just extruding, scaling, moving. Also rotating things to make sure I get the right rotation in there. And scaling these edges up slightly just to make sure that the curve in there is correct. This part is pretty small. I think it's about 2-3 inches high or something, so no reason to go too crazy with detail there. And these are the actual parts that will make sure it can be attached to that plate. Just a small bit of spacing I'm doing here. Then doing an extrude around the edges. With a few problems that I have to solve when I use extrude. It's not perfect. Just connect this up. Do the same here. And then connect these. Then add the nut in there. That will show how this hook is connected to the bracket. The other side, rotate 180 degrees, move it in. Like that. The hook is red because I think it looks more interesting. And there's a small amount of smoothing distortion, and adding another edge there fixed it. Now I still need to show how this plate is exactly attached to the bottom, and of course it's done with nuts, so I'm using the same nut models, moving them around, attaching these like so. With that done, I just instance it to the other side, and we've done that extra detail as well. Here's another small one. There's this sort of cylindrical part that sits on the ends of one of the main pistons for the Ripper. Just adding a simple cylinder in there, making sure it smooths nicely. And I like adding this part because I think it breaks up the shapes that go in one direction. By adding this contrasting little ring onto it. And there's actually a few. I can just create those by shift rotating and adding them like that. There's another part here at the back, which is another bracket for attachments. Starting off with a box, just trying to get the proportions right. This needs to fit nicely. I'm not going to go over that too sloppy. And add an edge in the center, delete 1/2, just like we did before. You might say, if it's the same one as the one at the bottom, why don't you use that one? Well, it's actually different, as you can see here. It doesn't have one single upstanding plate in the center. It has 2 on both ends. So that's why I'm creating this as creating it over again. Same trick, perform an inset. Make sure I fix the center. Like so, using snapping. Adding a few extra segments, and then I select these. And you can guess what I'm going to do now. I'm going to perform an inset. I'm going to go over to use the loop tools. And I will turn these into nice little cylinders. Nice little circle shapes. Rotate them around slightly, move them up. You can see things get pretty messed up, but at least you get perfect circle shapes. Okay, need to align them to every plane. Then I need to snap them back into place. Like that. And once those are into place, I can just simply use bridge to fill up that gap. And then I scale those up slightly to get a uniform distance from around the edge of that hole. Then a few more simple connects to make sure that I add all the correct edges for smoothing. Just going over this really fast. It looks about okay. Happy with that shape. So I'm going to add in my symmetry, making sure that it works correctly. With the symmetry done, I paste on the Turbo Smooth, change the color to show I'm done with that part. And then I start adding a few extra parts that are attached to it. This is a sort of reinforcing part that sits in the center. With that added, I need to make sure it smooths correctly in the center. And for that, I need to make sure that my symmetry axis is aligned correctly. It seems to sit in the right position now, so looks about okay. We're going to copy it to the other side as an instance, and that's another detail done. There's a few small ones left. One of them is an extra detail here at the windows of the cabin. Using a simple box shape, like those two sides, and then perform an inset to get the smoothing right. Ring, connect. I think this is simply just a small little plate they welded on to make sure that this part closes correctly. Then there's also a handle to actually open that window. There's two even. I'm adding those into the correct position. And there's a handle that sits on the side of the roof, on those edges. And then there's a strange little part here. It's this sort of upstanding L-shaped thing. I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it stands out from the rest, so I'm going to model it. Making sure that that edge is slightly tapered, and adding the control edges. Control edges at the bottom also, and at the sides. Looks about okay. Needs a few of those nuts for the added detail. So I'm aligning them with that part. Move this out. Looks a little bit too big, so I need to scale that down. And there's two, otherwise that part would rotate and wouldn't stay into place. I'm going to attach it to the main shape. There we are. And here's an interesting detail that I felt like I missed on the previous reference pictures. There's this special little shape on the outside of the big parts of the suspension. And I'm going to add that in because I think it adds to the detail on that side there. I find it hard to describe this shape. Not really sure what I should call this, but you can see what it is. And it's very slightly extruded from that part of the suspension, so it's hard to see. But I think it's interesting, so I'm just going to create it as a separate part. It would actually be better to model this as a single part and make it one piece with the suspension. But things have gotten so complex there, I feel like I shouldn't do that. So I'm going to do a little trick. And if I scale up the base of that part where it meets the suspension slightly, it's going to look like it was attached as a single part. Need to make sure I line up with that edge over there. I'm going to scale that one up slightly so you can't tell that these are actually sitting into each other. And there are some smaller holes at these sides also. They're round, so I need to use the loop tools again. For the loop tools, there's always a lot of fixing required, so that's what I'm doing. And then I extrude them inwards. Trying to get the part right. That looks about okay. So I'm using attach, and it's attached. And that should be almost it for the details. slight few tweaks here. Just a bit of tweaking on these edges. Let's get that out a little bit. Okay, that's it for the details. Hope you learned something from how I have these small things, and next video will be another big change.